Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to our first episode of Archon's Adversaries, talking about Tyranids and Tyranid hive fleets. Now, this is our first set of adversaries, so we'll be going over quite a few things. This is a prototype, as it were, and it took me a little while to make, so be aware I'll be doing my absolute best to give you an understanding of how to take down the entire Tyranid roster in a realistic scenario. So, let's talk about army operations. How do the Tyranid armies operate? Their targets are Imperial worlds, or generally anywhere with any level of life forms. They could attack uninhabited feral worlds, jungle worlds, anything of that nature, but they prefer things that have, a pulse and flesh. Not necessarily because it makes it easier for them, just because that has more calories bang for your buck than eating grass. Objectives. Their goal is to consume the biomass, the flesh, the carbon-based life of all living things on said planet. That is pretty much their myopic goal. They will get rid of or destroy anything in the way of that goal. So, talking about stages. Let's just say that they're invading Planet X. This will be a planet we'll go over in a bit, and what forces are available we'll go over in a bit. But Tyranids show up invading Planet X. What are the stages of invasion? Well, the first one is the Shadow War for the Tyranids. Now, this goes into the Shadow and the Warp, which we'll talk about in more detail a little bit later, but it is a psychic field that is kind of the precursor or the first warning that a planet will have that the Tyranids are coming. It also comes into the orbital war. Now, the orbital war for Tyranids, aka they're going through real space and having to travel between planets, is negative for them in both ways. They have to deal with the fact that they're expending energy and not gaining energy. They're having to reabsorb some of their creatures in order to continue traveling. And in addition to that, they are starving, quite literally. The hive fleets will starve if they don't find enough food within a certain distance. Starving to death is not as common, as they can go dormant and just drift through space until they find something of value, but they prefer to actively hunt out prey within a system and squidge around in their big hive ships to find a target. The other reason that Orbital is so risky for Tyranids is it's the one area where a lot of different forces can destroy them without the Tyranids really having a chance to fight back. If it's a small enough group of hive ships, like the one that we're going to be talking about for Adversaries, if it's a small enough unit of hive ships, a decent-sized Imperial patrol will probably be able to take care of it, or at least follow them and harry them at a distance, because Tyranid weapons are almost universally pretty short range, and they rely pretty heavily on their bio-creatures and their various subspecies of weapons that can be kind of countered by range, but more importantly, Imperial vessels are just going to have a lot of advantages over the Tyranids in the orbital war. So, destroying them before they reach orbit is really preferable, because it means the Tyranids will have a harder time getting to the later steps, but the first step will be the Shadow, then the Orbital. Now, there's an optional one here, and we'll be talking about Gene Stealers more in depth if we ever get another Armies video. I will probably do Gene Stealers and or Inquisition, depending on what people want. But Gene Stealers are the other way that this starts. So, on one side, you have a pure Tyranid invasion, where it is a splinter of a hive fleet that has broken off, and they've decided to go after Planet X. The other way of doing it is there are already gene stealers on a planet. The gene stealers, they infiltrate society much like chaos cults. They genetically modify a large portion of the population. They psychically dominate that portion of the population. And then they cause an uprising before the Tyranids get there to attract the Tyranids, let them know that there's food there, and then, of course, be reabsorbed by the hive mind and literally get eaten. So, those are the three first stages. Those are the first warnings that Planet X will have about the Tyranids showing up. It'll be the Shadow and the Warp, the orbital war. Either there's going to be orbital defenses on the planet that detect and fire upon these Tyranid ships, or the local Imperial Navy force, a garrison or a warning force, some satellite is going to warn them, hey, Tyranid ships incoming. And then the last one is Gene Stealers. Now, Gene Stealers obviously are a whole other faction of their own, which is why I'll be keeping them separate from Tyranids, because Tyranids does not necessarily mean Gene Stealers are involved, and Gene Stealers doesn't necessarily mean that Tyranids are involved. They can work together, but Gene Stealers can be a completely separate entity, and some Tyranids that people usually include in the Gene Stealer roster are actual Tyranids. So you'll notice that a couple of items are conspicuously missing in this Adversaries episode, specifically Lictors, because I believe that they belong far more in the Gene Stealer category than they do in the Tyranid category. Because, again, all Gene Stealers are Tyranids, but not all Tyranids are Gene Stealers. That's kind of how it works for me. Initial deployment of the pools. So what a set of ships will do, if they've overcome the orbital war, if they've gotten to the planet, they're sitting in high orbit, they've released their Gene Stealers and their initial units, and the Shadow in the Warp is growing in strength, they will drop down essentially a big old blob of flesh onto the ground. Now, what is this blob of flesh? Like most things for the Tyranids, it is just a terraforming effort. Essentially, what you see down here, these kind of sphincter-looking spiky flesh pits, those are the pools. The pools spawn Tyranid creatures out in large numbers, and over time, as more biomass is added to them, and of course as they continue to absorb the land, eat trees, grab grass, destroy stuff, etc., and they get fed by the lesser Tyranid forms that they create, these pools get larger and larger, and the creatures that they can spawn get more powerful. Obviously, the hive itself on the ships may have creatures already preformed to protect the pools, but the pools are a much more reliable way of making the Tyranids, and because the Tyranids tend to reabsorb creatures after a fight in order to not waste the biomass, because they reabsorb creatures, it's harder to develop them again without expending a ton of energy. So the pools are more efficient, they're easier to drop down and not worry about, and because most Tyranid fleets don't want to drop an entire ship onto a planet to act as a base, because they want to continue moving on to the next world, and to do that, they need their ships to stay in orbit. Tyranid ships can struggle a lot with getting out of orbit, and then back into it again, so because Tyranid ships work essentially via very, how do I say this? They fart through reality. Quite literally, they expel superheated gas in the rear part of the ship, it builds up, it shoots out like a pulse jet engine, and while that may work in space, it becomes considerably harder when you have to combine that with an atmosphere. So having a lot of pressure, having a lot of strain on the quote-unquote internal organs of the hive ship, I severely doubt that any but the largest of hive ships could actually get themselves back out of a planet's atmosphere unless it had very low gravity. I might be wrong about that, but just considering how they actually eat their food as well, how they consume the biomass once the planet has been terraformed, quote-unquote, it also makes sense to me that their ships would not want to land unless they really, really were having a hard time making the pool step work. So, the initial deployment of pools, this is going to have essentially what was left over from the last fight. So, whatever parts of the Horde were left over after the last fight are going to be deployed to defend the pools and defeat them. The pools are going to get fed, they're going to get bigger, they're going to start producing gaunts and termagants and things of that nature. And then we get to the next step, which is Horde development and the first round of evolution. So, Horde development, that's when you've got all sets of the Tyranid hive mind working together. There are synapse creatures that have grown up on the planet, they've developed quickly out of the pools, or they've been dropped down from the hive ships. And out of this, a force is created. So they have their infantry, their bruisers, their monsters, their leaders, their synapse creatures. All of those have developed, and the first step of the Horde is ready. Now, the Horde is where the Tyranids go from, grabbing random patrols, eating smaller populations of people on Planet X. Maybe they live in a big forest for a few hours or maybe a couple days, and they're just grabbing all the biomass they can. That's when they're in that initial pool stage where they're still developing. But once they get some decent creatures, some warriors, some synapse beasts, and a couple of leadership units, they're going to be in the Horde stage where they start going after large population centers and migrating en masse to start delivering more and more Tyranid biomass to other areas so that they can continue developing pools and make more areas from which they can spawn. So that first horde development, that's where Planet X can start seeing it go from a minor incursion that's causing local issues to, okay, now we're dealing with a large Tyranid army that has dropped down on the planet, and they're starting to attack large portions of the population, like hives or large settlements or cities. The first round of evolution, this is kind of a process that happens over time, but it also seems to happen no matter what. Because the Tyranids are absorbing genetic material in the spawning pools, and they're eating, essentially, consuming and converting biomass into fuel for them, it will begin to change them ever so slightly, you know. They will modify something like their skin to change a little bit to fit the colors of the landscape. They might modify some of their legs or eyes or faces in order to fit in more with the background or to deal with mountains or forests or anything like that. Lots of different changes will happen during the first round of evolution, and it happens over time. Evolved creatures tend to come out of the spawning pools, where previously evolved or unevolved creatures from the old horde, those will eventually get phased out or reabsorbed. So the Tyranids continually improve as they're eating more biomass. You know, sometimes these are absolutely pointless evolutions, very minor things, but as these stack up over generations, and especially because the rounds of evolution, you can keep going. You can keep going, you know, round 1, round 2, round 3. They continue to improve. Every time that they get beaten, every time that there's a large number of them destroyed, they will reabsorb some of the previous clutch, evolve them, and then spit them back out again with improvements. And this cycle of go out with a horde, get beat, come back, get reabsorbed, get evolved, keep going out again, that will repeat until the entire planet is consumed, or until the Tyranids are beaten off of the planet. So if you can find the spawning pits, if you can go to the original point of the incursion, if you can kill all of the Tyranids, all the synapse creatures, and burn the spawning pools, there's a pretty solid chance that the fleet will either have to leave in order to find a weaker target, or will have to land. And if it lands, like I said, that's probably it. They're going to consume your planet, but it's going to dramatically increase the timeline that the Tyranids have to think about in order to get off-world. Like I said, there's probably not a ton of Tyranid vessels that can actually get off of a planet, which is why they prefer to stay in orbit. But if they really have to, and if they're like, well, we can't get to the next target, it's too far away, you know, we can't cut our losses and leave to get to the next biomass, just land the ship and we're going to try and stay dormant and live it out here, you know, thug it out on Planet X instead of trying to get to the next world. That's technically still a win. I know that you're all dead, but you have stopped a Tyranid hive fleet splinter, you know, saving theoretically a large portion of your galaxy, or a large portion of your subsector. So that consumption or death thing, that can be the death of the entire planet, or it can actually be success. You know, on occasion we have seen Tyranid invasions where we go back to the source, we get all of these Tyranids, or at least all of the synapse creatures killed, and then we burn the pools, and the fleet just has to leave. They either have to go on and try and find another target, or they'll drop down, or they'll, you know, have to restart anew. They can restart this process, but it is remarkably energy intensive. And a lot of the Tyranid math is literally weighing the cost in calories to do X strategy versus the cost in calories to do Y strategy. So they really almost have a video game logic of like dominant strategy, what's working, what's not working, let's stop doing this, start doing this. So force size. When we talk about adversaries, I'm going to be talking about the size of the force that we're dealing with. The general rule with adversaries is I'm going to make them about even, and we'll talk about all the different aspects of how this might happen. So, force size. We're talking a single squadron of hive ships, which is a splinter of a standard fleet. The branches involved, obviously the Tyranids have ground, air, land, and sea. Probably sea and void won't come into too much contact here. Obviously, the void ships are going to want to stay in the in high orbit, so that we don't have any issues with getting back off of the planet. But Their air forces, their ground, and their land forces will absolutely be involved. Sea, while the Tyranids do have some aquatic morphs or modifications, obviously, like I said, the evolution part of Tyranids mean that they can develop to live underwater or basically under any circumstances. Most circumstances, they're not immune to, super painful things like fire, lava. There are certain exo-worlds that are incredibly volcanic. Tyranids could deal with the heat and possibly the gases as well, but, swimming through lava is probably a little bit of a big ask for a vast majority of Tyranids. And then commonalities and variants. So, there are several hive fleets. They're essentially just... there's a couple of things with hive fleets. One, there are different strains that certain hive fleets prefer. Some of them prefer psychic stuff, some of them like big monsters, some of them like this, some of them like that. Now, the original lore on this was that it was an intentional decision of the hive mind, or that it was some sort of coordinated effort to test out theories. I actually disagree with this. I think it's much more likely that these are the old guard Tyranids. So they're the old hive remnants from the bigger mass. So, again, when the Tyranids first invaded the Imperium on Tyran, with our buddy the Inquisitor, who decided to destroy every planet in their path rather than actually try and kill them, when they first invaded in Tyran, they were very basic. They hadn't developed a ton of super weird morphology or ecology yet, but as they continued, as they ate planets, they got more and more developed. Now, I think that original Tyranid strain, that OG hive fleet, essentially, I think it's Kraken or Leviathan. I'm not exactly sure. I'm sorry, Tyranid guys. The hive fleets are hard for me to keep straight. And it doesn't really matter for this video as much. If I do an army video on them, I will talk more about the hive fleets. But I think that original fleet, the reason why all the fleets that came after it had different specialties or variants was because of the worlds that they were eating, and the old guard, the ones who had survived the last invasion, getting reabsorbed and re-put out, essentially Pokemon style, in the next set. So, if you have an evolution of Tyranids, unlike Genestealers, who will always be roughly the same, if you have an evolution of Tyranids, and you're on a new planet, the hive mind will literally pick out, I'm going to put this mutation with this one, this modification with this one, and I'm going to change it as optimally as the hive mind can. It isn't super fast in its reaction speed. It is fast compared with like normal evolution, which takes thousands of years, but it isn't, it isn't going to do this overnight. It certainly won't do it instantly. But it will pick and choose which mutations it wants to do, and then the Tyranids that come out of the spawning pits will be custom-made using the genetic data that they have on hand, which is why I think that the hive fleets that we have now have so much variety. They're almost custom-built because the genetic bank, essentially, of those fleets became larger and larger with time. Basics of how to resist a Tyranid army. So this is a big one. I'm very sorry. This will be a long video. I just want you to be aware. Now, I'm going to also be doing less of the art here. This is just some nice eye candy for you. I'll mention it a couple of times, like for this one, we have these Tyranid hive ships. Essentially how a lot of them fight is wrapping up and grabbing ships, in addition to having their own weapons. But Imperial ships that get this close to hive ships are absolutely stupid, and their commanders should be shot because they can way outrange most of the Tyranid weapons. But that's another thing. If we ever talk about naval combat with Tyranids, that will be more of a focus. But at the base level of defending against the Tyranid army, you have this kind of quandary. Do you want to focus on mobility or on defending against them? So if I'm on planet X and I'm in charge of the defense, let's say I'm the planetary governor or I'm the PDF commander, and I've been put in the overall defense of planet X. Do I want to keep all of my forces very mobile? Do I want to steal civilian vehicles and use them to move my troops around? Or do I want to hunker down behind my defensive structures and let the Tyranids run for a little bit and then force them to come to me? We're going to talk about this in a bit. You definitely want to split your forces between mobile and immobile for a lot of reasons, but you absolutely cannot afford to have all of your forces moving around. And the reason for that is Tyranids are really good at asymmetrical warfare and at killing civilians and using them against you. Because they can eat anything living, essentially, leaving large portions of the planet, and especially the planet's population, undefended is a guaranteed lose. You are so screwed if you think that you can leave a hive or a large city unprotected from Tyranid invasion. You know, if you bring out the entire PDF and you have them march in a straight line towards the Tyranids, they're going to engage you, sure, with, you know, the best units that they have. They're going to try and bloody you as best as possible. And then they're going to send about 10,000 cheapo units towards your civilian areas, and they're going to try and murder all those people and set up a spawning area inside of the place you're protecting. So you want to split your forces between mobile and defensive. So who to call and how? So you want to call for literally everyone and anyone. The Tyranid army is a massive threat to your entire world. If I'm the planetary governor, I am screaming on every Vox frequency. I am shouting into the warp with my astropath. I don't care if it kills them. I am having every ship on my planet that has an astropath also scream into the warp. I would absolutely send out vessels that are currently in dock. I would have them leave and run, essentially. Run as quickly as they can. You know, make sure they're clean of gene stealers or anything like that, but make sure they run as fast as they possibly can, get out of the range of the shadow in the warp, and just try and get a message out. Because the main advantage of the Tyranids is the shadow in the warp doesn't allow you to call for help. But the shadow in the warp comes a good distance ahead of the Tyranid fleet, which means because the shadow in the warp freaks out psychers, it makes people uncomfortable, it can mess with things like electromagnetic radiation sometimes. It's sometimes shown as having this weird purplish effect on planets, but that might be just a visual thing. I'm not entirely sure. But I know that it does make people uncomfortable. It makes psychers freak out, and if it's very strong, it makes psychers explode. But there is a period of time there where, as a planetary governor, I'm going to grab every astropath that I have, and I'm going to send them on a whole bunch of different little freighters, cold freighters, warp freighters, and I'm going to send them as quick as I can and say, go out in every cardinal direction, get out of the shadow in the warp, and start screaming, X planet is under attack, reinforcements needed, please, for the love of God, it's the Tyranids. They might not come after you, you might not get any help because the Imperium takes a while to get there, but let's say that we do that. Let's say for the sake of this situation we do that. We send out, ahead of the Shadow of the Warp, ahead of the bulwark of the Tyranid offensive, we send out a couple of ships, and they come back. And they say, okay, cool, we went, and the planet one system over from us, or one galaxy over from us, or, sorry, one solar system over from us, or whatever, had two Imperial Guard regiments ready. We brought them back, and they're here with us now. Great, land. So that gives us our planetary defense force, plus one large walled hive, and two Imperial Guard regiments. Let's say one infantry, one armor. So, that's that dealt with. So the Shadow in the Warp, it's silenced our Psychers, it's made them kind of freak out. If it gets really strong, if the Tyranid force gets really large, or if the spawning pools or any Psychic Tyranids get close to them, it'll probably just outright kill them. And then how to deal with Gene Stealers and Orbital Attackers. So, like I said, Planet X has, let's say for the sake of simplicity, one walled hive with some very basic defenses, including orbital defenses. And then it also has a couple of large cities scattered around the planet. Not uncommon, still counts as a hive world, which is why a large proportion of Imperial worlds are hive worlds, but they're only having one hive, with a lot of other like civilized world type stuff around them, or even agri-world type stuff. There are some hive worlds that can also function as agri-worlds. We'll talk about that if we ever get to like Imperial planets, which is an Archon's Arcana or an Archon's lore video that I was thinking about doing. But yeah, Gene Stealers and Orbital Attackers. So with Gene Stealers, they're going to get their own video and how to deal with them as well. But Gene Stealers are essentially going to try and subvert your society, so you really need to root them out like Chaos Cultists. It's hard to do, but you could do it with genetic testing. You could theoretically do it by autopsying the dead and identifying who is related to the people involved. They are a little bit better organized than Chaos Cults, just because they literally MK Ultra people into attacking the planet via subversion. But Apart from dealing with them, which is important to start the fight off with so that you're not dealing with Gene Stealers in the rear and Tyranids in the front, the last thing is orbital attackers. So, as mentioned, the Tyranids do have orbital weapons. They're mostly considered parts of like bioplasma, or they use little shooting off spikes or stems or tentacles or things of that nature that hit other ships or put creatures, literally shoot like baby Tyranids and other types of Tyranids like drop pods or like drill pods into other ships. So in the case of our planet, let's say that our one basic walled hive might have a pair of flexible macro weapons. Let's say, for the sake of argument, it's we have a void shield with maybe 10 or 20 layers, and we have 2 macro cannons that are both flexible. That's pretty well defended. That's acceptable for a basic level hive. What we would probably want to do is prep for what is coming. Now, what is coming? The Tyranids are going to find the highest concentration of people. They're going to drop down the pools somewhere. We want to try and identify where they're dropping the pools down, so we can start the first part of our defense plan, which is to isolate the pools. But the other thing we want to do is make sure that they can't bombard civilian areas very easily. And the best way to do that is let the big guns speak. Don't hold back on firing at Tyranid ships with macro weapons, with orbital defense weapons. Now, on one hand, you are shooting at a heavy escort-sized vessel. So in this case, we're dealing with, let's say, 3 Tyranid hive ships, which are about the size of a heavy escort. So no capital or cruiser-sized, Tyranid bioforms here. None of those huge ones. So capital-sized bioships are a little bit rarer, especially on this kind of splinter side of things. You're going to be looking at more heavy escort size, maybe light cruiser size. But yeah, these are not something that are totally immune to your standard orbital weapons that a hive might have access to. So let the big guns speak, and absolutely make sure that the Tyranid ships can't just glide over you and drop a bunch of Tyranids down on your doorstep. Best way to do that as well is to keep a force defending that high population area around the hive. So, dangers and restrictions. The Shadow freaks people out. You want to keep your civilian population, under lock and key. You don't want them out and about. If there's Gene Stealers around, you might even want to lock them down. A lot of Imperial worlds, especially hives, have built-in fallout shelters. They're not super strong, but you can hermetically seal the hive, which means to protect them from NBC, nuclear, biological, radiological, and chemical. So they can seal themselves hermetically, which can assist with keeping out Gene Stealers or Tyranids, or it can also localize the damage that they do. If you order every civilian to go and bunker down in one of these bunkers, or to stay in their habs, and then you lock the habs, you can pretty quickly find out from the amount of screaming in the area how many Gene Stealers are around, and more importantly, okay, are there Gene Stealers here? Are they eating people? Are they starting an uprising? Now we worry. But if there's nothing like that happening, it still is a good idea to keep the people inside of their homes, because if random Ripper swarms, if gargoyles, if any type of small kind of ranging scout Tyranids manage to get a hold of them, that can really quickly cause panic. It can cause people to freak out. It can cause miscommunications within the Imperial Guard or within the Planetary Defense Force. So if there's some small incursion that really isn't an issue and it could be solved by a couple of, personnel, a couple of Planetary Defense Forcemen, and you send like a whole division of 100,000 men there, that could be a waste, and it could also be a distraction. So you want to be careful with that. And the other thing is evolution. You know that you can't afford to wait. You can't afford to sit behind your hive wall, even if you have one, and just wait it out. You can't afford to let the Tyranids get enough mass and get enough evolution to start overcoming you. So it is not acceptable for a planetary governor to just sit on his hands and say, well, let the Tyranids come and batter themselves against my walls. I'm not going to risk my soldiers going out and fighting them. You are on a solid time limit for how long you have before the Tyranids start absorbing things that make them bigger, stronger, and capable of producing more powerful combat forms. So that evolution is going to put you on a time limit, the shadow is going to silence you, and the population centers are going to limit you and endanger your defense. Assumption is an adversary. So this is one of the things that is just going to come up with these videos. It's assumed that the forces on either side are relatively equal. So, 3 hive ships, heavy escort in size. They're each going to have a certain amount of Tyranids left over from the last hunt or left over from the last feeding. And of course, they're each going to set down some hive pools somewhere on the planet. You want to track those. Versus your orbital platforms, in this case, like we said, it's 1 walled hive. So it's a hive that has a hive wall. And it has 2 orbital weapons, not including anti-aircraft guns and smaller caliber weapons, and possibly also some defensive artillery emplacements. So, the other forces that we are working with as Planet X's Imperial Governor or the military governor or whatever general has been put in charge of this campaign, we're looking at 2 million planetary defense forces, which means, you know, the basic guys that we've talked about with planetary defense forces before. They might have bolt-action rifles. It's more likely that they're going to have a semi-automatic autogun, no body armor, fairly inadequate training and technology, and, you know, relatively simplistic forces. And the other side are, you know, we've talked about what the hive is, and then we got out our warning quickly enough. 2 Imperial Guard regiments were either on leave on the planet, essentially they're resting and resupplying on our planet, or they got here quickly enough to get in the way of the Tyranid threat. One of them is line infantry, and the other one is armor. Let's say that it's 5 companies of Lehman Russes, so somewhere in the range of 50 armored vehicles, so 50 tanks, and let's say 30,000 infantrymen for the Imperial Guard Foot Regiment. 30,000. You'll notice when I talk about the Imperial Guard, I actually tend to put their numbers a little bit more in the median area. Obviously, a line infantry regiment could be anywhere between 25,000 and up to 100,000. I'm putting this as a little bit more average. Let's say 30,000 infantrymen and around 50 tanks. Standard Lehman Russes. Now, let's talk about the troops that we're going to be seeing here. These are the baseline foot troops, the Gaunts and Termagants, or Termagants. Their deployment usage, they are the initial fodder, and they use horde tactics. So you're going to see these guys in large numbers, and they're essentially going to be thrown at you as waves. That doesn't mean that they're useless. They're very deadly, even individually, but they are pretty animalistic and uncontrolled when there isn't a synapse creature around. So they use horde tactics. They're in large groups. On the tabletop, I think they go up to groups of 20, or maybe up to groups of 40, if I remember right, from older editions. But either way, I would see even the initial insertion, the initial groups from the pools, they will probably have a few thousand of these guys. And you might say, well, I have 2 million PDF troops. The PDF troops are traveling at the speed of foot. And they're probably not as well trained in marching and carrying heavier equipment than the Imperial Guard are. So, in general, the Imperial Guard have the advantage of being able to go around and try and deal with things on their own, you know, make use of their mobility and their better training to go kill things, where the PDF are going to want to stay back, do civilian damage control, and protect fortifications, because that's where their weapons and training excel. So, weapon analysis. There's a ton of Tyranid weapons, as there are a ton of Tyranid creatures. I'm going to be going through each of them. If you want more of an in-depth on any of these in specific, I am going to do Xenos weapons videos, so just understand Adversaries is not a replacement for that. It's just a way for me to explain it. Spike rifles, they're a muscle harpoon crossbow. These are a little bit esoteric. They're a little bit large. Termagants are the ones with guns. Gaunts are the ones that just have scything talons. The spike rifle, it's kind of a harpoon gun. It shoots long barbs. Almost everything the Tyranids have either has poison or acid on it. It's part of those evolution things, so they develop that by eating from the local fauna. It shoots a long harpoon-like dart. It's got pretty good range, pretty good range, not so good on the side of ammunition and resupply. Strangleweb, kind of a super specific one. It's a net goo gun. So it says that it's a spider-like organism that essentially shoots out a bunch of gloop onto you, and it works a little bit like a strangler. It wraps around you, it sprays onto you, and then it literally, as much as you struggle, it crushes against you. So it's almost like being wrapped in angry rubber bands. It can kill you, but it's very much more likely to just stop you from running. Spine Fists, these are a little bit more common. I just call them poison spike air guns, because they're on the Tyranid's fists, and they essentially kind of do a really big huff, or they breathe really hard, and it sprays out these little poison spikes. A little bit like needles, except that they don't have a payload. It's more like they're just coated in poison. These are probably not going to be all that great against enemies that have some decent body armor. Most Tyranid poisons are pretty bad, but the Imperium has found ways to, get antidotes for them. And of course, the Imperial Guard are going to have medics around. If I am the planetary governor, I want to grab as many doctors, stims, protective measures as I can to try and prevent the poison, gas, and acid from hurting my men as much. Again, still deadly, but not inconceivable that you could survive it. Scything Talons. These are the ones that are used by the Gaunts most often. There's hooked, kind of bladed war pick-like weapons. These are not really sophisticated. They're not really dueling weapons. They make it very simple how they fight and attack. It's essentially like a spider, if you've ever seen them kind of fight against one another. They rear up onto their hind legs, and then they stab down at the target. Now, this has a couple of disadvantages. One, it limits the directions that the Gaunts can fight from. Obviously, they do the most damage hitting directly down at the target, which is a pretty solid thing, but it exposes a lot of their undercarriage to you. They're armored on the upper thighs, head, and back and shoulders. Their weakest spots are their ribs and the underside of their joints and arms and, their stomach, essentially. So, the Scything Talons, they have limitations in where they can strike. Obviously, hitting from, below isn't really possible with them, but hitting from the side is fine. They have another pair of arms with shorter little talons, like grabby talons, so they can kind of hook you and then stab you. But these are made of very tough chitin, so it's not metal, so it can stab in, it can penetrate through light body armor. It's pretty decent in terms of, speed of attacking, especially because these Gaunts can get, super adrenaline boosted, and they can attack more. Devourers, this gets into the maggot guns, or the bug guns, as I like to call them. The maggot guns, these are a separate biological creature that, like a lot of the Tyranid weapons, are essentially bonded with the host in so much that the host uses them as a gun, and they get to be shot and die. I'm not sure how evolution factors into this. It seems a lot more like abusing some poor innocent animal. I'm kidding. But the Devourer is one of the basic versions of this. There are better ones, especially the ones used by warriors are much better, but the Devourer is the basic one. It shoots essentially a whole bunch, a little swarm of angry white maggots that try and feast on your flesh. These things drill into you with their little mouths. They kind of bite at you, and it kind of covers you in these flesh-eating creatures. So this is one of the ones where I think, having some nice body armor, like some light body armor, or having, fully enclosed uniforms. If you had exposed skin, the Devourers would definitely be more of an issue. But if you had some nice flak weave, if you had some pretty heavy coverings, if you had that 3-piece helmet that the Khazarkan and, other light storm and shock troops have, you'd probably be pretty unafraid of the Devourer. It can still get into weak spots, but it is also noted that these things don't live long. They can't just grind into you forever. They can't eat you an entire, but they can get pretty deep into your body, so you want to try and rip them out as quickly as you can, or crush them. I would imagine that after getting hit by the Devourer, you're kind of dropping your gun and slapping around at yourself, trying to kill these little white worms, or green worms, or whatever these are. Just foul creatures, and it shoots like a whole splurt of them. I hate that phrase, but splurt is the best description I can give you. Flesh Borer are like the Devourer, but they're a little bit angrier, and they don't penetrate flesh. They're kind of built to penetrate armor. Now, the Flesh Borer, what it does is it fires a single larger maggot, and it hits the target, it grinds in, and then it explodes. It doesn't explode, with a detonative force. It doesn't have any, explosion to it, but it kind of pops, and inside of it is a bunch of poison and acid, pretty much. So this one's a little bit better at penetrating armor. I would definitely be afraid of this, even if I was wearing some light flak armor. And if I wasn't wearing any armor at all, this would probably just kill me. Because it is literally stabbing into you and then exploding a little kind of softball-sized pocket of angry acid on your body. So this is going to cause horrible wounds. If I'm in body armor that isn't heavy or medium, it's probably going to penetrate and destroy it. It'll definitely wound me. So this is definitely one of the better ones that they have at this level. So, tactics. Surprise and infiltration. Gaunts and Termagants are the first enemies that you're going to run into. They go in big squads. Even when the first time that the enemy drops down onto your doorstep, they're going to be letting out hundreds of Gaunts and Termagants. So they will get better ones as we go on. You know, they might start out with just the Spine Fists and just the Scything Talons. But as we get more biomaterial in, as we get more biomass, included within the pools, we're going to get better weapons as they come out. So, surprise on that side, out of nowhere, if you're, say, in a civilian city and you're a local policeman or you're some sort of PDF trooper wandering around, you're not really aware of what's going on necessarily. The planetary governor is still discussing with his generals about how to react to the issue. It's been a couple of days, but all that you've really been told is you're on high alert now, go get your rifle and walk around and make sure that nothing's causing trouble. Nothing has yet, and then 30 or 40 of these little angry bastards jump out of the woods at you and, well, you have a bolt-action rifle. What are you supposed to do? So, the surprise part is really the fact that these are the first ones whose feet touch the ground, and they're the first ones to get off running. And they run quick, and they run towards any targets that they can. They gather up all the biomass that they've gained, they bring it back to the pools, they feed it, they get more brothers, they go out and do it again. The other side is infiltration. Gaunts and Termagants are relatively small. And if they have a Synapse creature around that can control them and tell them to do smart things, because without a Synapse creature around, they act like dumb beasts. They just go after living creatures wherever they may find them, not caring about how big or smart or dangerous the enemy is, just going out, trying to kill things and bring the flesh back to the mother hive. But when they have a tethering creature, when they have an organized force, they can do some really crazy stuff. I'm talking dig through sewage lines and kind of go into and infiltrate hives. They can go into areas in ships and kind of hide in there for a while and then come back out again. They can do stealth and they can dig down into the earth or they can climb trees. They're small enough and their weapons are kind of quiet enough, especially with the melee weapons, that they can get around with being a little bit more stealthy and affording infiltration. However, they're also great scouts because they all have a little whistle in their head where they can kind of wheet and they can blow through a little hole in their skull, and it makes a really loud whistling and hooting noise, which I love that that's some really cool lore for them. But it also allows them to basically, there's a Termagant every 20 feet outside around the hive pools, and if any of them lets off a whistle, all the other guys know where he was, and they go and kill you. So variants of special tactics, really the big one, and this is kind of universal amongst all of them, you'll also notice that when I tell you about a weapon or something once, I won't mention it again, even if another unit uses it. And some of them I'm not going to go into in hyper detail, like these ones, but I'm giving you these ones as examples of what Tyranid weapons are like. But kind of universal, especially as we get more evolved, are going to be poison, both low grade and high grade. It's generally going to be stuff that does more damage the more of it that's pumped into your system. So a little bit of certain poisons is going to make you feel bad. It's going to make you feel sick. It's going to make you feel uncomfortable. Might make you, ill, literally infirm. Maybe cause some lasting internal damage, but enough of it will kill you. And especially with no medical interference. Acid, on the other hand, Tyranid Bioacid is super weird. Some versions of it don't do a lot more than, burn through flesh, and then some of them can burn through tank armor. It seems to be based on how big the creature is, but in general, just understand that if you're getting hit by a Tyranid weapon, it's very rarely just going to be one thing hitting you. It's not just going to be, a kinetic impact or anything. It's usually going to be laced with either poison or acid. The only weird exception to that is some of the talons. So the scything talons, the extra large talons, and the kind of sickle talons, the really big ones. Those ones are purely kinetic. The worst weapons to use against Gaunts and Termagants, I would actually argue, are some of the shorter hafted melee weapons. So, using, say, like a standard axe, like a woodsman's axe against a Termagant, or against a Gaunt, is probably not a great idea. Stub weapons and even auto weapons are pretty decent. I'd put them in acceptable weapons. So, worst weapons would definitely be shorter range or short hafted melee weapons, like trying to knife a Tyranid's not a great idea. On the acceptable weapons, because Gaunts are relatively weak and they can be killed pretty easily, they are absolutely adrenaline filled and they are angry little buggers, but they still have an exposed skull, they have internal organs, they will die if you do enough damage to them. Pretty similar to a human, except that their backs and shoulders are armored a little bit better. Acceptable weapons, I would say the most acceptable options here are single action or bolt action auto guns. Obviously, bolt action is going to be worse. I wouldn't put that as the absolute worst, but it's definitely worse than the standard auto gun, the kind of semi-automatic or full auto options. Another pretty solid one against the Gaunt variants is going to be any type of long hafted melee weapon. So if you're on a feral world and you don't have access to a ton of firearms necessarily, and the ones that you have might be kind of single shot or very slow to reload, I would say that having a spear or some sort of halberd or hammer impaling a Gaunt or a Gant is a pretty solid way, since they aren't all that much heavier than the average person. Matter of fact, some of them are even lighter, especially some of the smaller Gants, but some of the Gaunts are pretty big. But if you had a pike or some sort of halberd or something, you'd want something with a long-ish haft that you could use to essentially impale the Tyranid, and then somebody else comes up and finishes it off. Obviously, that's in the very early stages. You wouldn't be doing this in the later stages, because a lot of the Tyranids will have firearms, or just ranged weapons in general. So killing off a little squad of 20 Gants and Gaunts with your Ren Fair militia of 150 dudes, that may be doable at the early stages, but later on that's not going to be acceptable anymore. And then the best possible weapons, I actually think that there's two that make the most sense here. The first one is Heavy Stubbers. Heavy Stubbers strike a really nice balance between being able to put Termagants and Gants down with one shot, almost no matter where you hit them, or with one burst of 2 or 3, and being able to have a high enough fire rate to decimate entire squads. So, the Gaunts and Gants, they're pretty quick, they can run really fast, but they're not faster than a bullet. And they are relatively easy to spot, unless they are evolved enough to start hiding. And in that case, heavy weapons are going to be a little bit too tough to target them with anyway. But machine guns, things like that have full auto fire, those are absolutely going to be some of the best weapons against Gaunts, because you can mow them down. They're running at you, their only real option is to try and melee you to death, and if you have an emplaced, heavy, fully automatic weapon, you have a pretty solid chance of hosing them down until they die. The other one I would say is las guns. The armor on the Gaunts and Gants protects only their back and head, basically, and some of their shoulders. Las guns are very effective at putting down unarmored or lightly armored enemies. And I would argue that a las bolt at medium or short range could probably go right through the armor on the average Gaunt or Gant and cause an explosion. If you're shooting through the armor, I would say put an extra 2 or 3 rounds into them just to make sure that they're definitely dead. But if you hit them in the head, face, mouth, or chest, 2 shots is pretty much a guaranteed incapacitate or kill. So the las gun is definitely a good option there. even better than the autogun in this situation because you don't have to worry as much about your lasgun running out of ammunition or being at extreme range than you do with your autogun. And also, since the lasgun is basically a point and click weapon, it is a lot easier to see a target running really fast, kind of snipe it a couple of times, and not worry so much about leading it. And again, the reason I don't include Genestealers in this one is just because they're getting their own army video soon. Depending on what you guys pick for your next one. So, light troops and scouts, miscellaneous. So we have spores, rippers, and gargoyles in here. That is a gnarly looking gargoyle. So, deployment usage. The mines are some of the earliest ones that you'll see. So this is kind of an optional unit. These three are all optional units. The Tyranids can choose to spawn any of these, but they will generally be used pretty early in the campaign, and they might be a feature later down the road. But essentially, they do different things. The spore mines float around the battlefield. They spit spores everywhere, which can create both more spore mines and create areas where the Tyranids can live. They are filled with poison and acid, as usual, the standard Tyranid combo. Whenever they feel something around them that's living, or they get shot or run into something, they detonate, spraying everything in the area with acid and poison. So they're pretty useful at just covering a large area with, living landmines. The Rippers, these are kind of a combination scout and, tunneler unit. They are basically just piranhas. They're like larvae. They travel in large swarms. They go underground, not super deep in many cases, but they can just go under the surface where they don't get as damaged from machine gun fire or something like that. And then they emerge underground where they feel tremors, and they grab people and chomp, 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 kill them. And then the last one is gargoyles. So these guys are essentially termagants with wings and no legs. So they have stingers, they can still bite you, but they all, for the most part, have ranged weapons, or I think some of them have scything talons, but I'm not entirely sure. What this allows them to do is it allows them to be super cool at asymmetrical warfare. All of these are asymmetrical warfare, but the gargoyles are kind of premier for this because they can fly. So weapon analysis. The spore mines, they're explosives, can't cover a huge amount of area, but they are pretty solid in the fact that they can move towards a target. Even if they can't see, they can detect living, moving things with their tentacles or with their, sensory organs, whatever those may be, and they can go towards them to make sure that they have maximum effectiveness. It doesn't work as much on vehicles and such, but it is still acid. And as mentioned, some Tyranid bioacid can be really effective against certain armored vehicles, especially lightly armored vehicles. Not to mention that dripping a bunch of poison into a vehicle might hurt people. The Rippers, they really are like piranhas. They just use their teeth. Some of them don't even have arms. They might have little tentacles that they can use to squidge around. They're not necessarily blind, but they don't have great vision. They rely a lot on their sense of smell and on the sense of tremor. But yeah, they don't have any really special weaponry at all. And for the gargoyles, they really are just using the same exact weapons as termagants a vast majority of the time. They're using the same weapons as Gants, so as we get more Tyranids, as the variety gets increased, the gargoyles will get more powerful the same way that the termagants will. Their tactics are asymmetrical warfare. As, Defender of Planet X, if I see any of these happening, I'm going to have the Guard try and deal with it, because my PDF troopers are going to struggle against it. Why? Well, they would struggle against the Spore Mines because they don't have as much protection. They don't have any of the NBC protection, the masks or the protective flak weave that the Guard have. They'll struggle against the Rippers because they don't have the high ammo capacity or the high rate of fire that the Guard have. And they'll struggle against Gargoyles because shooting against a flying target that's shooting back at you is actually pretty darn hard. And especially when Gargoyles can be pretty small, the average PDF trooper is going to have a harder time hitting him than a guardsman who has a fully automatic lasgun or a heavy weapon who can just spray up in a direction and track the gargoyle and kill it. Not to mention that the gargoyle's weapons can theoretically work outside of a range where my auto rifle or my bolt-action rifle are going to be as effective. So, very useful at asymmetrical warfare. Variants of special tactics, I think I just went over that a little bit. The worst possible weapons against these. I'd say the worst possible weapon against the spores is anything that is short range, but also it's anything that is super high caliber or useful. It would be a massive waste of ammunition, for example, to use auto cannon rounds against spore mines, where a las pistol round will pop them and explode them. A heavy bolter is going to be a waste of ammunition. So it's more just don't overkill them. Against the Rippers, the worst possible weapon is going to be something with limited rate of fire. You really want high rate of fire, preferably something flammable like a flamer, or explosives to get rid of the Rippers. Failing that, it's not impossible to beat them off in melee, but it is definitely more dangerous than running away, because they're not all that fast. Running away and shooting them. Gargoyles, worst possible weapon is anything that has limited range and bad accuracy. So, a short carbine bolt-action rifle is probably the worst possible option, considering that there's a lot of civilians and militia and some PDFs that are equipped with those weapons. Yeah, I'm not surprised that gargoyles are so hated, because they're really annoying. You know, these things can be spawned in their thousands once the spore pools really get up to speed. Once the spawn pools really get up to speed. So having a bunch of guys who are essentially laying on their back, shooting up at the gargoyles with bolt-action rifles, definitely the worst possible options. Acceptable weapons, pretty much among all of these, is going to be the ability to fire fully automatic and to have relatively cheap ammunition. Auto guns are great. Fully automatic is preferred. Semi-auto is okay. Some of them, matter of fact, most of these will actually benefit from some sort of auto cannon with a high explosive round, or with a fragmentation round or a flak round. Especially the gargoyles, you absolutely want to have an auto cannon with flak rounds. Even if it's a 15mm autocannon, this is one of the situations where the super high level heavy stubbers and the low caliber autocannons are very useful because they have high rate of fire, they can pack in high explosive, and they can theoretically become flak rounds. So all those are great, and I'd actually argue that the better side of autocannons are going to be those best possible weapons. Now, assuming that our guard regiment has those, great. Assuming that they're a little bit more average and they might have heavy bolters and then the tanks have heavy stubbers, cool. Those are still perfectly acceptable. They'll do the job. Now, biggest page in this presentation, bruisers. This includes warriors, raveners, the biovore and exocrine, and the hive tyrant guards, or hive tyranid guards, or just hive tyranids in general. So deployment and usage. These are elites and sub-commanders. Now, to begin with, that early stage where the Tyranids are just developing into their kind of warlike form, they're getting the spawner pools down, they're deploying their first brace of gaunts and termagants. These bruisers are going to show up as the remnants of the last living fighters from the last campaign. They're going to be unevolved to begin with, and they're probably going to be reabsorbed and updated a little bit later. But what they act as is they're effectively the elites and the sub-commanders for the hive mind initially. Hive Tyranids are a bit of a different thing, and we'll get to them when we get to their weapons, but the warriors, at least, they act almost as unit commanders or as sub-commanders. So they will synapse creatures, they'll connect to them with the hive mind, and they will use them to push them in a direction that they want them to go. Now, weapon analysis. For a lot of these are used between a lot of different ones, so I'm just going to go over them. Bone swords, they are a regenerative force weapon. What does that mean? Essentially, it is a super low intelligence creature that lives in the hilt of this bone weapon. They almost look like a cleaver. And they project a weak psychic field similar to that of a force sword. Myself, personally, I think that this acts a little bit more like some sort of psychic covering or coating than a true disruption field. So, while the force sword creates something akin or equivalent to a high-grade disruption field, these would probably be on the lower grade end. So, still dangerous, still protected against a lot of damage, but I don't think it's going to be hacking through things as easily as a standard force sword will. So it's more meant to protect the bone sword from harm, rather than to deal a ton of damage. It still can deal a lot of damage. It's basically a cleaver with a little psychic edge to it. But the other thing is, because it is chitin and because it is a creature, it can actually regenerate itself. So if that field gets broken, if it gets damaged even through the field, it can heal itself, which is nice. Lasher whips. So these exist on a lot of different creatures. They're kind of just an additional thing that gets put into their morphology somehow. And it is literally a living whip. It is an individual creature with a bunch of barbs on it that reaches out from the creature's hand or from its control surfaces or from its underbelly, wherever it may be, and it just grabs living things and tears them apart. It is purely kinetic. It's not really all that impressive beyond being very annoying and the Tyranid not having to necessarily use it. Like, he doesn't have to swing the Lash Whip. It just does its thing on its own. The last one for the Warriors, well, not last one, but the big one for the Warriors is the Death Spitter. The Death Spitter is like the other maggot weapons that we've talked about. It just is way bigger. And it has a specific thing where it is directly coded for acid. So this one shoots out a very similar thing to the other maggot guns, except this is like a little bug, and it shoots out at the target. It has longer range since it's much larger. It kind of spits out, and it hits the target. It digs into the target with all these little claws, and then it explodes in a little acid balloon explosion. This is much more deadly, not only because it's a larger acid coming from a larger barrel, it also has some ability to dig into armor. So even if I was in something like light carapace armor, this could theoretically compromise my armor and then spray me with a bunch of acid. Where I might have survived the smaller acid weapons, this is probably going to hurt me and or kill me. If I'm not in any armor at all, or if I'm in light armor, this is a death sentence. It's a lot of acid. It's a lot of penetration. If I'm not in any armor at all, it's just going to stab into my chest and then basically melt my torso. The next one is Big Claws. So these are like scythes, but they have a little bit of difference. So you can see them on the Warriors here, on the Exocrine's belly actually as well, and then also on the Ravener. So the Raveners, they can dig. They essentially are like the Rippers. They're just bigger. They're like a Tyranid warrior and a Ripper had a kid. And they're also creepily synapse. So they have 4 of these. These are much larger. Unlike bone swords, they're not actually protected from things like power and chain weapons, but they are much longer, which means that they can have increased reach. They can stab deeper into targets. And because they're equipped with more of them, in the case of the Ravener, they can attack a lot of targets at the same time. But more importantly, they can keep a hold of you with one and stab you with another. So, it's like the normal scythes, but longer and better. Exocrine weapons, these are a giant organism that lives on the Exocrine's back, and it will either shoot out a big ball of bioplasma or acid, or both. So, Tyranid bioplasma has always been a weird thing to me. I'm not really 100 on how it works. But effectively, it is a superheated material inside of the Tyranid's body that takes their regular mutagenic acid and shoots it out at a very high temperature, and it splashes and melts stuff even better than their standard acid. So their bioplasma is just kind of hyper-heated acid. Again, the logic part of this series kind of falls apart when we come to Xenos weapons, because they don't need to be logical, but that's my best possible take, is it's some sort of hyper-heated acid, because, of course, acids become quite powerful when you increase the temperature. So, bioplasma is that, and then the acid, it can also just fire an acid. Now, unlike most of the weapons in this list that have a very shortish range or medium range, the Exocrine and Biovore are very long range, and all of their weapons are geared towards penetrating tanks. Now, in the case of actual penetration, it's not so much that you're going to be blasting through the tank's armor with kinetic energy. Even with the bioplasma, it's much more of like smashing an absolutely enormous water balloon onto it. But with the bioplasma, and even with the acid, you can deal significant damage. You can break the tank's weapons, you can break their guns, you can damage all kinds of stuff. So, it's very much a kind of don't get hit by it, or you might be out of action, and then because the Exocrine is probably not alone, it's going to be firing at you a couple of times, and it'll try and knock out your tank. Now we get to Hive Guards. They have 2 weapons. One of them is the Impaler Gun. It's a giant harpoon cannon. I don't really know how to explain it better than that. it shoots you, it stabs you, it kills you. And the other one, the interesting thing about it is that it's one of the only kinetic weapons in the Tyranid armory. The other one is the shock cannons. These literally are mental tasers. They basically shock you with electricity from the creature's body. A sidebar about Hive Guards. I love these guys like I like Warriors, but I think Hive Guards are some of my absolute favorite for two reasons. One, the basic form of them is this kind of centauroid, super heavily armored carapace type deal. And these are Bruiser's ones are the ones that have actual body armor. Essentially, they are more protected. Even if it looks like they have weak points, they are more protected. But the Hive Guards, they are tethered to the Hive. They are really going to be the protectors of commanders. They're kind of sub-commanders. They're not going to be out of range of other Synapse creatures. And some of them, like the melee Hive Guards or the Tyrant Guards, they can't think for themselves at all. They are directly kind of mind-slaved to whatever commander they're working for. So those guys are pretty rare. You're not going to see them unless you get onto a Hive ship, or if a Hive decides that it wants to move down a very large ship to a planet in order to assist with assimilation. Probably not going to happen in our scenario, but not impossible if the Hive decides to spawn some sort of large, very complex Synapse creature. All of these guys can be Synapse, but very specifically, the Guards have a weird thing where they are hyper-linked to one Synapse creature as a protector, or they can also act as individual Synapse creatures. Usually the ranged ones are one way, and the melee ones are another, but that just seems to be my understanding. Their tactics, when I say tactical deployment, I mean it like this. These are the first units that really have, one, armor-piercing weapons, and two, have the ability to control other creatures via the Synapse. So the Synapse, I've talked about it a couple of times, it essentially turns a normal Tyranid from dumb beast that's operating under animalistic rulings to actual soldier. Like, they become very intelligent, they become tactical, they start to use their weapons better, to move better, to fight better. They can use augmentations and, like, adrenaline boosts and things of that nature. Very nasty stuff. And once you kill the Synapse creature, whatever creature is extending the direct tethering or control of the hive mind onto those smaller creatures, or those non-Synapse creatures, you will start to get better results. They'll go back, they'll revert to being more animalistic, they might get confused, they might start attacking each other, they might start freaking out, like some of the Biovores or Exocrines, I think, can explode. Not a good idea to be near them when that happens, but they can get damaged like that. So, tactical deployment. They're going out with other units of non-Synapse creatures, and they're commanding them to do stuff. They're having them do actual objectives rather than run around, gather biomass, and go back to the pools. So, they're deployed in very specific roles. Obviously, this is the first ones we start to see really specific jobs like guards, or like anti-tank, or heavy, or, squad commanders in the case of warriors. And Raveners, they're also kind of stealth troops, but stealth in the way that they kill you. The other thing about the tactical deployment is they all have better body armor. Most of them are very well protected. The Exocrines and other monsters like them will have the equivalent to medium vehicle armor, so they'll be about as protected as something like a Chimera would be. The Raveners are a little bit less protected because they dig and they need to be squidgy and, leathery and like a snake. The Warriors are pretty solidly armored. I would compare Warrior armor to any version of, heavy Carapace armor, where I would compare Hive Tyranids to being a lot closer to power armor. So, anything that works against, the worst type of weapons against basically all of these is going to be low-caliber weapons. We're talking autoguns, lasguns, probably a waste of time. You could go for weak spots, but killing a warrior with a lasgun is probably, you're going to need to be on full ammo, and it might take you 2 magazines. And you better hope you have friends. So, worst possible weapon is going to be really basic infantry weapons, things that don't have a lot of armor penetration. Acceptable weapons, this is one of the ones where I'm like, hell guns, plasma guns, definitely great options. Plasma guns because you can fire them multiple times. Hell guns because full auto plus armor piercing. Another great weapon would actually be crack grenades and crack missiles and rockets. Those can pretty reliably put down these guys even in one shot, and with some of them, like the Ravener, it's actually a massive overkill. But this is another example of ones where I would say that bolt weapons are probably the best. So bolt rounds against these guys are, they kind of bridge the gap between a heavy stubber being able to fire fully automatic and have nice kinetic impact, and a hell gun having high armor penetration but being an energy weapon. So I'd put bolt guns at the very top of acceptable, and then probably best would be heavy bolter. The heavy bolter excels in this area. The autocannon can, but if you have a low caliber autocannon or a super high caliber autocannon, you're only going to be able to hit certain targets. You know, a very middle of the road autocannon, something in the range of 35 millimeters, kind of a defensive autocannon, that would be very effective, but a heavy bolter is just as effective and has some serious upsides in terms of its after penetration effect. So, you know, it explodes, as opposed to the autocannon might just penetrate. And it might also detonate, but heavy bolter has more explosive to it. So best possible weapons for these guys, I would say heavy bolters and medium range autocannons. Moving on. Sorry, this is going to be a long video. Vehicles. Transports, we have the Mawloc, the Trigon, and the Tyrannocyte. For armor, we have the Screamachilla, the Carnifex, and the Tyrannifex. For aircraft, we have the Harpy, Harridan, and Hivecrone. Oh man, that's a lot of stuff. Sorry, these are big, very big. The creatures and this video. Deployment uses, these are logistics and problem solvers. You're not going to see these in every fleet. You're certainly not going to see them on some small world like Planet X. You might see one or two of these show up at the end, if we're really giving them trouble, or if they're having a hard time penetrating the hive wall or getting around our defenses. Logistics, things like the Mawloc, Trigon, and Tyrannocyte, while they are creatures in their own right, what they really do, and same thing with some of the Brooder types, is they make way for smaller creatures to get in behind defenses, or to get around the enemy. So kind of that logistical transport slash moving around. I think this is the Tervagon here in the middle here. I didn't mention it there, but it is kind of that brood mother creature. For the armor is essentially the tank equivalents, and the aircraft are also going to be kind of flying support weapons. And those are the problem solvers as opposed to the transports and the logistics use. Tyrannocytes are basically just giant spore pods. They're like drop pods, but for the Tyranids. They kind of have a very similar function. When the ships get there, they'll probably drop Tyrannocytes to actually get the first set of terraforming done. So you'll want to follow the Tyrannocytes and try and destroy them quickly, but yeah, again, that's Planet X. I'm talking in general now. So, weapon analysis. On the individual side, all of these will have extra large claws. These are the first really big ones that can kind of get through vehicle armor. Especially things like Tyrannifexes and Carnifexes. They can shove their weapons right through the side of tanks. It's possible with the smaller ones. The issue is more how much damage they do afterward. With these huge extra large claws, you can penetrate right through an armored vehicle and rip out a huge section of it, or you could carve off a barrel of a gun. It does take time and effort and maybe some, a couple of readjustments to actually use them effectively, because they are still, hooked claws that are super long. They're sharp on only one edge and the tip. So slashing them around or whipping them around, not as effective as that, directed, intended slash downward, or that impalement or impingement on the target. Brooding. So this is a thing with the Tervagon, and also with some of the Mawloc and Trigon versions, and also the Harridan, I think. They essentially spawn lesser Tyranids, so they are actively taking bits from the birthing pool, they are implanting it into their DNA, and they are birthing Tyranids as they fight. Or as they go. So they're creating their own little infantry cadre to go around with them and help them out. So, large biocannons. These are on the aircraft, the Harpy and the Harridan. They essentially take a couple of different things. They take very large amounts of bioacid or plasma, bioplasma or acid, or sometimes poison, and they shoot it out and basically soak an area. So think of it like a napalm bomb from our reality. They're driving by or flying by, and they're just kind of pasting a whole area. They're very much like flying artillery guns. They're super effective against mobile units. They're very good against certain, light infantry and stuff like that. They can kind of just obliterate them with almost no damage to themselves. Tendrils and gas, these are things that come in with the various like big tank-like ones. The Scream-a-Killa does have kind of a bioplasma thing in his throat. But that's not as important. That's pretty much unique to him. He essentially screams and sprays acid. It's cool. But a little bit more common are the tendrils. Like I said before with the Lasher tendril, these kind of grow out of different Tyranids, and they just kind of act on their own, and they shred things that get nearby. It's essentially a measure so that you can't run up to the Tyranid and stab it in the side with a chainsword and just kind of grind it apart within its arc. So it acts as like almost scratching the creature's own back by itself. We talked about that with tanks before, where you take a machine gun and rake away infantry. The Lasher tendrils, or the extra tendrils, they do that, but for big creatures. The next one is gas. So Tyranids do use some gas weapons. Generally, this is either acidic gas in the air, or it's literal poison gas. One of the big ones that do this are Carnifexes, and I believe the Scream-a-Killers do it as well. Their big vents on their back literally spray out a bunch of black poisonous fumes. And that does for them a lot of the advantage of a lot of the things that the tendrils do for bigger beasts. So it keeps the infantry from being around them, it keeps enemies from getting too close, and it can deal damage even when this big single-minded creature is just focused on one target. He can still damage things in an area around him. The other weapon, the big one, is the Rupture Cannon on the Tyrannifex. The Rupture Cannon, it shoots a little kind of seed pod, or like a creature pod, at a target, and it shoots it at high velocity, it hits the target, and then that little seed kind of snaps open, almost like a Hesh round, a high explosive squash head round, where it flattens against the target and then explodes with a little detonation of, I think it's bioplasma, it might be something else, or acid. And it essentially hits a target, kind of dents it, and then sprays it with a bunch of this high-grade acid and smacks it as this seed or egg pod explodes. It's very good at armor piercing. Can damage the Lehman Russ tank. It can damage other heavy armor. Can probably destroy most medium vehicles. And it's one of the most powerful ranged weapons in the Tyranid arsenal. On the ground, at least. So, very cool one. The tactics, on one side, you have the ones who are more wrecking ball creatures. I would say that the Tervagon, the Moloch, and the Trigon fall into this side, along with the Carnifex and the Scream-a-Killa. Those ones do one thing. They go after big targets with their big dumb weapons, and they just beat them to death with their giant scything claws and poison everything around them. So they work as siege breakers, they work as line breakers. They're not subtle, they're not quiet, they're not stealthy. They just kind of run at individual targets that the Synapse tells them to hit, and then they smash into them and fight until they die. The other side is monster tactics. Now, how are monster tactics different? Essentially, it means that there is a single individual creature. It doesn't necessarily have to be Synapse creature, but it is a creature around which all of the other lesser creatures can conglomerate. Now, why is that a great thing? On one side of things, if you're a defender, if I'm a PDF trooper on the wall and I see a Tervagon, and I see her brood of Termagants around her, I could shoot at the Termagants, but then this giant creature that I can see is very scary is going to keep birthing them, and I might not be able to overcome her birthing with my killing. Or I could focus on the Tervagon, or I could focus on the Harrier, or any other of these creatures, and then all of their little buddies are going to come and kill me because I wasn't killing them fast enough. So there's this kind of catch-22 of, if I go after the monster, the mobs are going to kill me. If I go after the mobs, the monster's going to get close enough to kill me. So this catch-22 works for a lot of the monsters in this. Variants and special tactics. There are a lot of variants, especially with the weapons. Again, acid, plasma, evolutions, all of that stuff can happen. But for our little scenario, these guys aren't going to be as common. You might see a couple of them. But where you see lots and lots of these guys, that's with the real hive fleet that might keep them around in perpetuity. Worst weapons against these guys, anything that's low caliber. I would even argue that even low caliber autocannons and low caliber heavy stubbers, those are going to be the worst possible weapons because their armor is thick enough that you're just not going to do anything. You'll be wasting ammunition. You might get the occasional lucky hit, but if you have a 15mm weapon, you're going to have to hit them in the face multiple times to kill them. And even with the flyers, it's going to take you a while to bring one down. Small infantry weapons,
yeah, don't bother. It's not a useless thing. They will eventually die, but you're definitely not going to be soloing them with them. Acceptable weapons, heavy bolter definitely works here. That penetration and explosion helps with a lot of the ones who you can hit in weak spots. The Moloch specifically reminds me of this because the Moloch has a lot less armor than the rest of these guys. The Screamachilla and the Carnifex are pretty well armored, and they keep themselves really low to the ground when they fight, so you can't hit their ribs as easily. But they still do have weak spots where a heavy autocannon or a medium autocannon will get through, and so will a heavy bolter. On the side of the best possible weapons, I would say your best options here are heavy caliber autocannons, las cannons, very effective. Most laser weapons don't do super great against Tyranids because they are going to be, having a lot of different layers of non-reactive material that the lasgun has to dig through, much like penetrating through steel. But a las cannon can overcome that pretty easily, and having a straight up hole through the Tyranid will probably kill it eventually. So those kind of high armor piercing, heavy weapons, definitely a good option. Moving on to leadership and command, we're almost there. The Neurothrope and the Zoanthrope, the extra large Titans, Synapse creatures, and Tyrants. Now, deployment and usage. These guys are pretty much just spawned as the leader of the entire invasion. There might be only one or two of these, or maybe even none, on our scenario. And if there are going to be more than one, it's probably going to be more than one Neurothrope or Zoanthrope. The deployment usage, yeah, they're the leadership units. They're going to be controlling the synapse for a whole bunch of different creatures. They're going to be dictating the macro level of the conflict. Their weapons, a lot of them use standard weapons, so the extra large titans, like the big old Hierophant, the Titan, the actual Titan, the extra large ones, they're going to be using things like biocannons, rupture cannons, super big acid sprayers, that kind of stuff. The Tyrants, they essentially use the same weapons that warriors do, but better. They're bigger, more dangerous. They can use them with two hands or with one hand because they have bigger arms. They're also better armored, more equivalent to a hive Tyranid than to a warrior. The Zoanthropes and Neuranthropes, they use psychic powers. They can project a little bit of the Shadow of the Warp themselves, and they can make Psychers go crazy, and they can also kill Psychers outright. They can use psychic powers. They can do weird warp stuff. But yeah, I can't really explain exactly what they do because it's warp magic, quite literally. They are psychic brain bugs. So they can control a lot of different creatures at once, yes, but they could also straight up fight with psychic magic, which is super unfair. Tactics, these guys are going to be deployed very safely. The Hive Mind has a difficult time recovering when these guys get killed, and it can cause whole sections of an army to just go into disarray if these guys get knocked out. So yeah, they're deployed kind of conservatively. They're only brought up when an enemy is absolutely dumpstering the force that's sent against them. So if there's a Space Marine company somewhere that comes in and absolutely destroys a unit, yeah, then maybe a Zoanthrope or a Tyrant is going to come out and stomp them. But until that happens, you're not going to put them on the front line. Worst weapons against these guys, pretty much anything short of a bolt gun, and maybe even short of a heavy stubber is not going to hurt them all that much. Zoanthropes and Neuranthropes, you just want something that's far enough away so that their psychic powers can't affect you. They're not super heavily armored, but they are a small, quick target with shields. So, high caliber weapons, rockets, things like that. For acceptable weapons, I would put bolt guns as the absolute lowest. Hell guns and hotshot las guns, acceptable for something like a Tyrant, maybe for a Zoanthrope or Neuranthrope, but not for a Hierophant. And anything above that is just a plus. Tyrants are heavily armored. They're difficult to kill. You definitely want to hit them with something heavy armor piercing. So the best possible weapons for them would probably be Plasma, Melta, power weapons are a great option. Zoanthrope, Neuranthropes, I'd say that the best possible thing for them would be to lock a missile on them and to try and hit them. But they have psychic powers that can, mess with your ability to target them. But if you were far enough away, or the other thing is, throw a satchel charge or drop something on them heavy and explode them. The Zoanthropes and Neuranthropes rely a lot on their psychic powers, and they're not as protected as the rest of them. the big Titans or the Synapse creatures like the Hierophant, you're going to want heavy tank weaponry for these guys. Tank weaponry works against the monsters as well, but especially just to damage the Hierophant, you want tank-sized weapons, and preferably firing heavy armor-piercing shells, because they are protected like a Titan is. Now, famous groups and how to disrupt their logistics. So this is just going to be the how to win category. How to resist initially. Now, we've talked about that stages. What I would do as Commander of Planet X, remember we have about 2 million PDF troopers, we have a lot of cities to defend, and we have a hive with a wall to protect, along with 2 regiments, 1 infantry, 1 armor. What I would say is I would break up my initial resistance into this. My armored units I would split up into 2, and I would have them take small detachments of PDF, and I would have them essentially scour out the closest cities to the Tyranid landings. I would try and find as many of those initial spawning pools as possible, and I would try and surround them with the Imperial Guard infantry, while the mass majority of my PDF troops stay in the hive to try and defend it, and set up defensive perimeters around the closest cities. The other thing I would do to initially resist, other than, shout for help, use my orbital weapons, would be start putting people in a defensive formation. Call up the civilian brigades, call for medics, call for any doctors in the area. Get as much civilian assistance as you can, because you're rapidly going to be outnumbered, and you want to have as many firearms in civilian hands as possible. So, recruiting people into the labor auxilia, getting penal people going, grabbing anything that you possibly can to help you with the resistance before it's too late. You want to hit this as quick as you can. So, that's the initial one. Isolate the Tyranids as much as you can with the Imperial Guard infantry. Find any incursions with mixed PDF and armor so that nothing can just blitz through and kill your PDF really easily. And then use a majority of your PDF to secure the main population center so that the Tyranids can't overrun it easily. The main goal of the Tyranids is to kill all the population, absorb them, and produce more and better creatures. How do you counter that? Well, the best possible way is to kill the foraging parties. If you find where the Tyranids are going for their biomass, if you find out that they're going after things like trees, animals, stuff like that, light the forest on fire. Start carpet bombing areas of land where you know that there's going to be animals. Napalm strike as much as you can. Light a bunch of stuff on fire with gasoline. Have a bunch of jeeps and cars going around with PDF troopers in them, literally killing wild animals and lighting them on fire. Treat it like it's Chernobyl. You want it to be a dead zone around the spawning pools, because you want these gaunts to have to travel further, and you want to catch them in your net as much as possible and kill them. The other thing is making sure that they don't escape. There are going to be that initial horde, that group of really strong guys from the last fight, who might be a little bit malnourished, but they're ready to come and kill you. You want to try and blunten them as much as possible. If that means throwing the tanks into the fray and having them crush a couple of warriors or kill a couple of hive guards or something, or maybe even an old Carnifex or something of that nature, you want to try and do that. You want to blunt that initial offensive, blunt that initial attack, and then contain and surround as much as physically possible. So that's how you would counter it, is to deprive them of food as much as you can. Deprive them of food as much as you can. How to sustain against this enemy. If you're in a drawn-out fight against the Tyranids, it's going to get really nasty really quickly. The more resistance that you put up and the more men you lose, the Tyranids are going to get better, they're going to get more equipment, they're going to get more people, and you really can't sustain against them indefinitely. They're not really like orcs where you can kind of tamp them down and they're never going to build up again, or you can bring them back to a certain level. The best way to sustain against them is to find organized groups of Tyranids, ones who have synapse creatures, warriors, identify them, start developing things like sniper corps or hunter-killer teams with what limited weapons you have, start integrating your PDF into the Imperial Guard, train them in better weaponry, get them out there and target the synapse creatures. The best way to sustain against them is to make the force toothless, and the best way to do that is to force the Tyranid ships to leave or give up, and then kill all the synapse creatures that you can. The best way to do that is individual hunter-killer teams, drawing them out with resistance and then trying to kill them, last-ditch gambit type of stuff, or overrunning the spawning pools if you can. If you can quickly destroy spawning pool number 1, you can burn it, you can get rid of it, make sure there's nothing around that remains. Then you have 2, you want to quickly mount an offensive against 1, maybe it fails, maybe it succeeds, but you want to try and localize the threat as much as possible. And then you want to starve them out, slow them down, draw them out, kill the synapse creatures, and then finally try and crush whatever resistance remains. And even if they drop a ship down on you and that gives them a bunch more biomass, you can be happy knowing that that's it. There's a limitation to how much they can actually bring down here. If you're successful in corralling them, with enough people, if you're successful in corralling them, you can effectively stymie the hive until it will degenerate. It's very hard. It's much harder than almost any other enemy in the Imperium to try and stymie the hive fleet, but it has been done and it is possible. And how to win. You win when the last Tyranid synapse creature dies. When the last synapse creature is dead, meaning the last one that is capable of sustaining the power of the hive mind, you've broken the siege. These ships will be forced to either land, which will decrease the shadow in the warp, allowing you to scream for help, or move on. And if you can kill all of the synapse creatures and ward off all of the ships, you've successfully resisted Tyranid invasion. That is very rare, and it's very difficult, but it's not impossible. And it's also not unheard of. So yeah, that is the first Adversaries video. Whew, that was fun. So, please note, disclaimer, things I will not be mentioning. A request for assistance on Adversaries should be. So, I didn't mention Gene Stealers. They're getting their own video. Don't worry. Once you guys vote for either armies or for another Adversaries on Gene Stealers, I'm going to have you comment whatever you want. That's what I'm going to do. If you guys thought that I forgot something, if you wanted more interest on something, if you wanted that kind of scenario thing with Planet X to be more in-depth, I could absolutely do that. If you wanted it on a larger scale, I am trying to do a scale that people can wrap their heads around. So when we're talking about a whole Tyranid hive fleet, at that point I can't really describe to you how to, nitty-gritty kill certain units. I can't do that because the number of units available to the Tyranids and to the Imperium when we talk about crusades and hive fleets, it just becomes numbers, and I can't really tell you it anymore because, well, it's a foregone conclusion. It's based on what the writer wants to happen. But at this low level, I can explain to you the logic of it, which is why I wanted to do Adversaries, because it's how to deal with each individual unit in the roster. If you wanted, more units in the roster, you think I missed something, you wanted me to do something specific on how to kill them, or if you had opinions on one or another weapons or something, definitely give that to me. This is kind of a trial run. If you thought that there were parts of the video, sections of the description that you thought were dumb or didn't need to be there or anything like that, please tell me. I really want to clean these up and get you the information that you want so that you can have the lore for you. So, Archon's Archive is going to be pure lore. If you wanted me to do something like trade, the Administratum, any type of law or justice, technology that isn't military, things like void shields, refractor shields, any type of narcotics. If you want me to talk about food, about logistics, how people eat, how production works, any of that stuff, world types, all that type of kind of imperial logistics or imperial lore stuff, that would be Archon's Archive, which I will put up. I hope you all join me for the next vote. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will say, when we hit 500 subs, I'm going to do a special Archon's Armory for all of you, possibly pertaining to all of the old legions. I will maybe drop some hints about that in the future, but I'm already working on it. I think you guys are going to love it. I wish you all luck, and I hope you have a wonderful good night.